So again, this is the bioengineered solutions to address water quality. We'll have 4 speakers: Admin Husic, Jarran Tindle, Ariele Kramer, and Kari Bigham. I see Andy Klein, but I don't see Jarran. And is Andy speaking instead of?
Hi, yes, this is Andy. Jarran and I are presenting together from the same computer.
Okay, good to know. You guys will be
Thanks.
second. Okay, so let's begin with Admin Husic. He is an assistant professor of water resources engineering at the University of Kansas, where he leads the eco-hydraulics laboratory. His team works to advance our understanding of the connectivity and transport of sediment and nutrients in human disturbed landscapes. The eco-hydraulics lab uses innovative methods such as high-frequency aquatic sensing, radioactive isotope tracing, and field to continental scale connectivity modeling with the goal of realizing resilient built and natural systems. Professor Husic received his BS and PhD degrees from the University of Kentucky. And you may begin. I'll mute myself.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Debbie. So yes, welcome everybody. And I hope this will be a good start to your second day of the Governor's Conference on the Future of Water in Kansas. As Debbie mentioned, I am Admin, and today's talk will be about using plutonium fallout to quantify streambank erosion in urbanizing Johnson County, Kansas. And really, before I start, I want to thank KU and as well as the Johnson County Stormwater Management Program for funding parts of this work. So it wouldn't have been possible without them. So I want to give them a thanks first. And I also want to thank, here in a second, I want to introduce some folks that help make this work possible. So as Debbie mentioned, I lead the eco-hydraulics team at KU. And these are the interface of the various things we do. And really, I don't do this alone by any stretch. A lot of this work is done by a fantastic group of graduate students who are on the right, and then undergrads who are in that box in the left. And really, I want to point out one particular undergrad, Abigal Percich. She did most of the work I'm going to present today. Okay, so she graduated as an undergrad this past spring, and she's moved on into a new phase of her life, but she did a lot of this work as an undergraduate research assistant, which is quite impressive. So I want to give a shout out to Abby there. Okay, so if we look at sediment erosion, connectivity, and the Anthropocene, in the last 150 years, humanity has drastically altered the water, sediment, and energy fluxes across the Earth's surface. And that's brought us into an era we've come to call the Anthropocene, or the time period where humans are having a significant effect on processes occurring on Earth. Large-scale farming, construction of impoundments and other kinds of construction, livestock grazing, and urbanization have changed considerably the availability, erosion, transport, and connectivity of sediment. So in general, the removal of the protective canopy, increases in impervious surfaces, and disruption of topsoil make the land surface more susceptible to erosion. And on this figure on the right, I show the blue dots are the annual loss of sediment over the last couple thousand years. And what we see is that the annual loss has increased by orders of magnitude since humans started to considerably work the landscape. And now humans actually are an order of magnitude more important at transporting sediment than every other natural process combined. In Kansas, we face a particular problem. We have a lot of federal reservoirs that we use for storage of water and flood prevention, but excess sediment transport and erosion is filling a lot of them up. Some recent surveys have shown that many of these may be filled to their design capacity within the next century, which is a problem. And if we look at the last century and a half, agricultural land use has really dominated the American landscape. If we look on the left, in the year 2001, we see the concentration of cropland and urban lands in the United States. And then if we look at the right, we see projections of what that's going to look like in 2050. Okay, where blue means a decrease, red means an increase. So for crops, some places are going to increase, other places are going to decrease in their crop intensity. But for the urban land uses, basically every place in America is going to get at least more urban. There are not many places becoming less urban in America over the next 30 years. And in fact, by 2050, the global urban population will double to 66%. It's about 34% right now. It's going to double. That's going to bring a lot of stressors to the environment with more impervious land cover, more construction, and more intensive erosive stream flow. So how will the sediment dynamics that accompany that urbanization alter the sources and pathways of sediment? So when we look at sediment tracing, a transported sediment particle in the river is really a mixture of all the different kinds of sources in a watershed in various quantities. So if we look at the left, if we take a snapshot of some material flowing in the river and we blow it up, and if we could pick out all the various source contributors, in this example, corn is contributing about 45%, or cropland that's growing corn is contributing about 45% of the sediment load. Okay, so what kind of tools can we use to tell us where sediment is coming from? Okay, these are called tracers. And one tracer that has recently become popular for analysis of sediment cores and hill slope deposition, but not really for transport in rivers, is plutonium, specifically plutonium-239 and 240. It was released in large quantities in the 1950s and 60s for nuclear weapons testing. So we released these unique isotopes into the atmosphere in large quantities. And over time, these plutonium isotopes settle onto the Earth's surface, where they adsorb to sediment particles at the Earth's surface. So if we look at the plutonium activity with soil depth, it's very high at the surface, but very low deeper down into the landscape. So something like surface upland crop soil might have high plutonium activity, but something like a stream bank would have very low plutonium activity. And this difference allows us to use this as a tracer. So that leads into my research question. How do sediment sources and pathways change with space and time under the pressures of urbanization? And we do this in an area of Kansas that's really urbanizing, and that's Johnson County. So Johnson County has increased in population by 35% since the year 2000, compared to just a 4% increase for the rest of Kansas. The underlying geology is primarily limestone and shale, and the soils that overlie that limestone and shale are silt and clay loam, so relatively fine sediment. We look at 5 different watersheds in this county, and they have a similar size, topography, pedology, geology, but they differ vastly in their land use. A watershed like Blue River has very little urban land use and has a lot of cropland. A watershed like Indian Creek has over 90% land use. Mill Creek is 50-50. Cedar Creek has some more forest and a mix of urban and ag. And Kill Creek is also very rural. So these differences in land use with similarities in other properties really make this an ideal test bed to assess the impacts of urbanization. Okay, and we look at how does the source of sediment vary across this landscape. And I have some diamonds and stars to represent locations where we collected surface and subsurface sediments. And each of these blue circles are locations where we collected samples from the river itself. This is what the river samples look like. On the left are these things called Phillip tubes. So we put these in the stream, we put fence posts in the stream bed, and water and sediment comes into this nozzle in the front. As the cross-sectional area expands, the velocity of the water slows down, allowing sediment to deposit and accumulate over the duration of the sediment deployment. So we sampled the 5 rivers approximately bi-weekly in 2019, and we collected about 32, 33 sources from stream banks and croplands, forests, residential areas, and grasslands. And this is a student, Aaron, showing what it was like to collect one of these samples. And we collect them rain or shine or ice in this case. So Devin here had to break through some ice to get this sample. We bring these samples back. We do a lot of analysis in the lab. This is a video of me doing wet sieving, which is a very mind-numbing activity. So this takes about 40 minutes for every sample, and we're doing hundreds of samples. So but that's the cost of getting interesting data. And the last thing we do is we run a Bayesian mixing model, which I'm not going to go into the details of today for time, but that model allows us to unmix the river sediment into its various contributions. So let's look at the results. 2019 was a historic wet year. I'm sure many of you remember the flooding in the Midwest on the Missouri that year, and the Kansas was extraordinary. The record rainfall that year, we had 1,358 millimeters of rainfall compared to 958 millimeters in a typical year. So almost 2 standard deviations above the typical rainfall amount. During that year, we collected 94 sediment samples in the river. 52 of them had enough mass to actually be analyzed. The others didn't have enough mass. And we have the stream hydrographs from the 5 sites that all look somewhat similar. The y-axis is logarithmic, so the changes are more apparent at the base flows. What we saw was that urban streams are flashier than rural streams. That's not surprising. And that during this year, 2019, mean stream flow in the rivers was 1.6 to 3.4 times greater than the historical averages in all the watersheds. The historic flow was dwarfed by the flow in 2019. So this allowed for a really high connectivity of sediment sources. What about the plutonium activity in our samples? What we saw that upland samples had significantly higher plutonium activity than bank samples, which we would expect given that the radioisotope absorbs the surface sediment and it doesn't migrate down into the soil column. So that was the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned was as we increase urban land use, the plutonium activity decreases in our basins. So it starts to resemble the bank sediment end member more. So as we urbanize, we appear to get more bank sediment, which is also something that's well recognized. To make sure that our plutonium activity numbers were not just the result of particle size effects, that just means that if you have one sample that has a lot of small particles, more stuff will stick to it and it can bias your results. We did some particle size analysis thanks to Tony Lazell and Spencer at the Kansas Geological Survey for doing this analysis for us. But we found that the median size of the particles was about 14.5 microns. So that is a fine silt. And we found no particle size effects, which is good. When we go to the Bayesian mixing model results, one thing we see is the y-axis is the bank fraction. So the amount of sediment in that sample that is sourced from banks. In our 3 rural streams, the top 3, we see variability throughout the year. Sometimes it's even split of half the sediment is from banks, half is from uplands. Sometimes more of the sediment is from banks. Sometimes a lot of the sediment is from the uplands, but there's some variability throughout the year. And that's true also for Kill Creek. And Cedar Creek, we didn't get a lot of samples because of flooding. But when we look at our urban streams, Mill Creek and Indian Creek, no matter what time of the year, no matter the flood intensity, we always get bank sediment. And the bank sediment fractions are really high. They're above 90% in almost every storm event. So there's less variability of the sediment sourcing in urban streams, whereas in rural streams, there is some variability and there's more contribution from both banks and uplands. When we look at the median, and then in the parentheses is the interquartile range of the stream bank contribution, we see that our most agricultural site gets 50% of its sediment from stream bank and 50% from uplands, whereas Indian Creek, our most urban site, gets 92% of its sediment from banks. and only 8% from upland sites. When we look at the pathways of sediment transport, during low flows, green is rural, red is urban. During relatively low discharges, we get high plutonium activity in our rural sites. And as discharge increases, the plutonium activity of the sediment decreases. So at low flows, we get more of the upland sourcing. So we get more surface erosion at low flows. As we transition to more intense events, we activate that subsurface stream bank gully erosion. Whereas for urban streams, regardless of the discharge, we basically have the same plutonium activity, the same sourcing all the time. And we demonstrate that in this diagram, contrasting the low intensity storm dynamics against the high intensity flood dynamics for rural and urban streams. And I don't have enough time to point out the various hypothesized transport mechanisms, but in rural sites during low intensity storms, we have rill and interrill, as well as tile drainage that transports surface sediment that's distal to the stream bank through these pipes into the stream. Whereas on the urban side, we have wastewater treatment discharge, which gives relatively sediment hungry water that will erode banks even at low flows. So we've successfully demonstrated that plutonium activity can be used as a tracer for fluvial sediment transport, and it can inform better land management and stewardship. So the next steps here is, as I showed this image earlier, you probably noticed that we only collected source samples in 3 watersheds. That was due to time and budget constraints. So as part of a new project with the Johnson County Stormwater Management Program, we're going to expand this sampling considerably. Okay, so this is what it looks like now. This is what it's going to look like soon. We're going to go from 1 year of sampling the rivers 2019 up to 4 years. We're going to go from 5 basins to 7 basins with Big Bull and Little Bull Creeks added. We're going to go from collecting source samples in just 3 watersheds to source samples in all 7, and from 33 source samples up to 151 source samples to get a more complete image of what's going on in the watershed. So with that, I'm glad to take questions. I realize I may have gone over a couple minutes there, but hopefully that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Admin. That was pretty much on time. We've got 4.5 minutes for questions. So you can type them in or unmute yourself and ask. Looks like Chris has his hand risen.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, is there with the next phase of this research, is there any plan to look at nutrient transport with that sediment transport to analyze the continued nutrients? I guess I have to confess, I'm looking at a proposal you've sent to Tom Stiles on my other screen right now, and I'm just seeing how those could really work together.
Yes, they're
in-stream loading.
right with the project that I have with the Johnson County SMP. We're primarily looking at just the sediment, but we are doing some carbon and nitrogen analysis. I would like to look at the nutrients as well, because the two, as you know, they're so strongly coupled, and a lot of the reservoirs, they have internal loading. The sediment may have started externally, but it deposits within the reservoir, and then it loads nutrients into the reservoir internally. So understanding where the sediment came from into something like a lake or a reservoir is important, and quantifying the nutrients associated with that sediment will also be important. I think it's something I certainly want to do. It's a matter of building that project out, and I'm more in the plan, as you know, in the planning phases of that. But it's something that I would very much be interested in, because the urban land use change doesn't only impact the sediment erosion dynamics, but also the kinds of nutrients we load to the landscape will change. In the image, as we transition somewhat from intense agriculture, grazing, and and crop growth to urbanization, that's going to accompany things like stormwater runoff, wastewater treatment, effluent. So this land use change impacts the nutrients as much, if not more, than the sediment.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to our next speakers, but feel free to type questions into the chat. And thank you, Admin. So we'll move on to Jarran Tindle and Andy Klein with the Kansas Forest Service. If they could share their screen. And Jarran Tindle serves as a watershed forester for the Kansas Forest Service. He is a 2016 graduate of Humboldt State University located in Northern California. There he earned a bachelor's degree in forestry with an emphasis in hydrology. While in California, Jarran had the privilege to work as a forestry technician in the coastal and redwood forests, which hold the distinction of being America's most productive and most heavily regulated timberland. So welcome to Kansas. And Andy Klein works as the water quality forester for the Kansas Forest Service. He provides, let me turn it off. He provides professional forestry education and technical assistance to private landowners and cooperating natural resource agencies in Kansas with geographic emphasis on those watersheds, mostly eastern and central Kansas, deemed high priority by the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy State Committee, or the RAPS people. So we'll begin. Welcome to our session, and you may begin.
All right, well, thank you. It looks like the computer's grinding away a little bit here, trying to share the screen. So we'll give it just a second, but thanks for that introduction. And the title of our presentation is kind of dual meaning, as those of you who know us probably figured out that we're kind of crazy. But also, oh, my PowerPoint quit. Gotta restart PowerPoint. We are kind of crazy, but the tools we're using here in our work are tree nuts, tree and shrub seeds. All right, can you guys see our screen now?
Not yet. One option, if you don't have animations or anything, save it as a PDF and show that.
Okay.
That's what I do to make things less intense.
Now can you guys see it? The PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. It'll look a little uglier, but we'll just click through as it is in PowerPoint and not in presenter mode there.
Well, this is a little bit of a report on a long-term fun project we've had, trying to make riparian forest buffer plantings more affordable, which is the cost of planting seedlings, bare root or containerized seedlings, and installing tree tubes on them. It's been cost prohibitive for a lot of landowners interested in planting a buffer next to their streams. So oftentimes they just opt to do native grass, which I think is also good. But for those that are interested in planting trees, 4 or 5 years ago when Andy and I started, it was really hard to get it done with them, even with cost share programs, because it was just so expensive and so much work taking care of them. And we thought, surely there's got to be an easier way, seeing as how if you turn your back on a farm in Kansas, at least eastern Kansas, it comes up to trees. So why can't we do it on purpose? So thinking about how we could work with nature more than just forcing ourselves on it, planting seeds came to mind. It's not a new practice in forestry, but it's one that hasn't been invested in very much in Kansas. And really the planting of tree seedlings, tree and shrub seedlings, has a fairly interesting and well-documented history in Kansas back to the Timber Culture Act of 1870 something. And reading up on the publications, forestry and horticulture reports, it was clear that a lot of intentional effort, thought, investment went into that, figuring out what trees would grow. And there was some attempts at using seed, but seed's just unpredictable as opposed to using seedlings. And so we decided to push into that a bit more, try to do some quality control, try to use agricultural technology essentially for planting precision, and try to find a reliable way to use seed in hopes of reducing costs and at times even producing higher ecological values. So that's where we've been. Andy has been working with the state interagency Streambank stabilization team, taking care of the buffer plantings on the Streambank projects that are, well, you guys are probably familiar with all that. But so that's been a nice place for us to have a reliable buyer, I guess you might say, someone places every single year to try things, and that's been really helpful as opposed to just private landowner interest, which comes and goes. You know, we might have 20 or 30 acres of buffers to plant with Andy every year. The stuff that I come up with, I might scrape by to get 10 acres a year. So we've had quite a bit of land to help develop this on, and are seeing some pretty good success with it, seeing some failures, seeing reasons why the old timers just wanted maybe the simple way and did it the simple, expensive way in the past. And there's times where it's really the right choice to use seedlings still, and we see that and appreciate that. But it's been fun to make some breakthroughs in the past few years, and we'll click through some slides and show you examples of probably mostly our successes, I'd say, and some of the equipment that is helping us to get this done. So you want to talk about any?
Sure. So what we're after is kind of a soils first approach. And so we'll kind of share through all these photos and a video of some of the recent developments we've had. And two things, we're after really kind of soils restoration, and just happens to be with mostly trees and shrubs. Sometimes we're using native grass in our planting locations, but whatever the practice, what we're after is soils restoration by getting perennial native vegetation there. And we have the good fortune to be able to work with trees here. So we'll start with our soils first approach for that's kind of our baseline, but then split into separate. First, we'll talk about our bare root planter and what we can do with cover cropping and no-till with that. And then second, we'll get a little more into the specifics of direct seeding. But this beautiful young woodland you see here is only 30 years old. 30 years prior, that was a cornfield that was moldboard plowed every year. And 30 years later, here it is, this nice, beautiful, diverse stand of high value trees. Nice little example of our bare root planter that's capable of no-till. Obviously, we like this nice green covered field a lot better than the traditional methods that typically rely on pretty heavy tillage to make the soil workable for lesser planters. But lots of tillage, basically have to destroy the soil structure in traditional bare root planting methods. From there, kind of the traditional thing was to manage it as fallow ground and cultivate in between those rows of trees. Those rows might be anywhere from as narrow as 8 feet, but more likely closer to 10, 12, as wide as 15 feet wide. So there is a lot of real estate in between rows of trees. And then within the row itself, spacing could range anywhere from 8 to 15, maybe even 20 feet again. So again, just a lot of space in between that is kept fallow with tillage, and just kind of looks like this throughout the growing seasons until all those trees reach 10 or 15 years of age and start to canopy over. More recently, herbicides are used, so a fallow herbicide program, but again, just bare ground out there. And both of those practices are very labor intensive. You know, in eastern Kansas here, every 3 weeks or so, you need to be doing weed control work out there, so the weeds don't get ahead of you. But our new tools, the no-till bare root planter that you can see in the upper photo here, like most other bare root planters, but it has a set of closing wheels that will close the trench in no-till planting conditions. And then this photo is our new no-till nut planter. But a little more on this bare root planter. You can go right into existing sod. Here's a strip that's been sprayed out. So we maintain all that vegetation on the ground, keep the soil covered, and don't have nearly as much weed control. So existing sod is possible. Otherwise, our real tools are cover cropping ahead of time. And this is a warm season mix that I had on one of my sites. And then the other big tool for us is nuts. And no, that's not the bulk bin at the grocery store at Christmas time to get a selection of mixed nuts out of. That's about 1,000 pounds worth of black walnut, bur oak, red oak, pin oak, pecan, several species anyway. So stealing some practices from the regenerative ag world right now, we're doing a similar thing as cover cropping and roller crimping ahead of planting, and for all those same kinds of benefits that you're probably all familiar with of weed suppression and moisture conservation. Aside from that, significant cost savings. Here's a typical schedule of activities with contractor performed prices, with that typical method of heavy tillage and mowing and spraying for weed control. That'll run you about $5,200 an acre to get a tree planting established. And if you go to no-till and utilize cover crops, it greatly reduces weed control work, and that cuts your cost almost in half. So lots of benefits in that bare root planter if you're going with bare root seedlings. But the real thing we're excited for is direct seeding. And Jarran, I'll let you talk a little more about benefits of direct seeding.
Well, high density, we're kind of still working on our theory of what the perfect thing to do is here. But one option with direct seeding is to go high density, similar to what you would find the density in a naturally regenerated forest stand, which varies quite a lot, anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 seedlings per acre. And just like happens naturally, we wouldn't expect 3,000 to 10,000 seedlings to survive. They'll kill each other out. Competition, species balance varies according to how the species fits the soil or environment in the microsite. So in a way, you can get a site to pick what species is best by mixing a lot of species together, throwing them in thick and letting them duke it out. What it does in the meantime is capture the site. It dominates the site and uses up all the growing space. So what we find, both in direct seeded projects that we've visited to see how they're doing, and also just in naturally generated areas, is that a high stem density of whatever species, say say it's plum or dogwood as a weed patch in a pasture, or if it's oak and walnut and sycamore and whatever else in a planted site, it excludes the weed species. So you don't find honey locust, you don't find rose, you don't find lespedeza, you don't find Johnson grass, all this stuff that can really mess up your plantings if it gets in there. Now, we still had to do weed control to make sure it doesn't get in there in the first few years. But once that site is occupied, canopy closure, and I assume soil closure, you might say, with our woody species, then it doesn't become a weed patch to infest the rest of the farm, which is sometimes honestly a problem with neglected conservation plantings of whether it be grass or trees or mix. So we want to capture the site, and my hope at least is that we can create walkaway plantings. And some of our sites seem like they are that, a lot of them aren't yet. But what I don't want to give a landowner is a site that's going to need babysat for several years or in perpetuity. I want it to set it up to be successful, and if he loses interest or passes away, which isn't unusual for people to be doing this in their later years, I don't want to make a problem on the landscape, because the project was going to need, periodic maintenance, and it doesn't get it. So so that's that. The other benefits that we thought theoretically we'd get, and it turns out we did, for instance, would be drought resistance. A couple years ago, it was real dry. Andy had planted his streambank buffers in 2 ways that year, done the bare root thing like normal, and also done direct seeding. It got dry, and the bare root plantings failed miserably, and the ones that were planted to seed did okay. And we were digging up seedlings, and just thinking about, well, why did these die, the others didn't? The root to shoot ratio is so different on these. A bare root seedling, when you get it from us or from wherever you get it, but you can buy it from Kansas Forest Service, it might be 18 inches tall and have 8 inches of root by the time you get done putting it in the ground. Well, when you plant from a seed, it's the other way around. In year 1, you might have a 4-inch high oak seedling, but the roots are 1.5 feet deep. So it's drought resistant, and really safe from having to replant potentially in these areas. What time do we need to get done here?
In about 1 minute.
1 minute. Oh, sorry. All right, flip through some pictures.
So we'll go through a couple pictures real quick. 10-year-old, high density, direct seeded stand. Looks like a thicket, looks like a mess. That's perfect. 20-year-old, another 10-year-old stand. A 20-year-old stand. Obviously, these are not ours, since we've only been working at this for about 4 years. But these are the results we expect. These are from some colleagues. And a 30-year-old stand. And this, again, that cornfield. Big, beautiful black walnut in there. So some examples of seed. Here's planting no-tilling seed green into a standing cover crop of cereal rye. This site looks wonderful today. And here's the really exciting thing. I'll play this video of our nut planter. And the awesome thing about this planter, so one, it provides no-till, so we can cover crop ahead of time and do the weed control work, fight drought, all the benefits cover cropping provides. But two, this planter is more precise for seed soil contact, for distribution, for everything compared to broadcast direct seeding. But again, no-till being the biggest benefit. Third, though, the biggest benefit of this planter, we were able to secure a grant to purchase this thing and have it made for us. So we're very grateful for our partners for that. But we asked them to also to put it on an implement caddy. So this planter can be taken off the caddy here in black and mount it on a truck. But also we can just,
Tractor.
or on a tractor, on the 3-point hitch of a tractor. But also, as you saw in the video here, we can just plant behind a pickup truck. So if a landowner picks up 2 bushels of walnuts one morning, we can show up that afternoon and run them in the ground with the pickup truck. It's just as easy as that, very simple.
So we're able to do plantings. It looks like a professional maintained planting could come in at about half the cost using seed versus bare root seedlings. So seed is half the cost. And we're still working out. Every site's different, but potentially it's free for landowners that would pick up their own seed. We just show up and plant with them, which is so different than saying you better set aside $4,000 or so if you want to do an acre of planting in the old way. So it's allowing us to do follow-up plantings. If say there was a planting failure or a project failed, we can go just redo it for free for a guy, and give the kind of follow-up service and interplanting that to make projects successful. If you have bad luck year to year, and if things go well, it's cheap to do it once and walk away. So anyway, we're pretty happy with the progress that we've been able to make on this stuff.
So we apologize for running over our time here by a minute or two, but get a hold of us at Kansas Forest Service if you want to discuss more. We'll talk your ear off about it. We're pretty excited about what's going on, and we're looking forward to providing another update in a year with hopefully even more success. But on this last slide here, lots we want to work on yet, and so we're always looking for collaborators. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. We had I don't think you addressed it, the cost per acre for direct seed. Was that on your first slide? Or was that seedlings?
That's using the newer, the cover crop plus our no-till bare root planter. I guess we didn't have a cost breakdown for the seed, but our napkin estimates and things are evolving. We're thinking whatever bare roots are our target, and when we get lucky, we're half the price of whatever you can do with bare roots. We can do for half the price with seed, and barring bad luck. But we're trying to, our goal is to take away that whole luck part to where it's predictable. The thing about bare root containerized seedlings is they are predictable, including when you can predict they'll fail. With seed, we're tightening up on our knowledge of how to predict what's going to happen, but we're not there yet.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed the photos and seeing the succession of the forest. Okay, and next we're gonna have Ariele Kramer presenting about John Redmond sediment loads. And while she's putting up her, her screen, I'll read her bio. Ariele Kramer is a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Kansas Water Science Center. She leads multiple cooperative research projects, including sediment monitoring on the Cottonwood and Neosho rivers, long-term water quality monitoring and nutrient and sediment trends in the North Forth Nenaska River and Cheney Reservoir, and characterization of harmful algal blooms in wetlands and slow-moving rivers above and below Kansas reservoirs. Ariele received a bachelor's degree in physics at Kansas State University and a master's degree in agricultural meteorology from Iowa State University. Okay, thank you, Ariele.
Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. Can you see my full presentation?
I see the first slide.
Okay, perfect. That's great. I was just trying to make sure you were seeing the right screen I had up. Okay, great. Thank you for having me today, and I'm excited to present and get to share some of this information on our John Redmond Reservoir sediment study. As Debbie alluded to, my name is Ariele Kramer, and I am a hydrologist with the USGS. I'm a project lead for several projects with the Kansas Water Science Center, including the John Redmond Reservoir Sedimentation Study, which I'm presenting on today. My studies cover a range of water quality concerns from sediment to nutrients, all the way to harmful algal blooms. So a little bit of everything. This study, in cooperation with the Kansas Water Office, consists of 10 years of continuous water quality monitoring in the Cottonwood and Neosho River basins to assess sediment loads into and through John Redmond Reservoir. All right, and I hope my slides are advancing. Can I get a nod that they are? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, perfect. All right, so federal reservoirs are an important source of water supply in Kansas, providing water to the majority of Kansas citizens. Sedimentation is filling our federal reservoirs, some faster than others, and reducing the storage space available. The USGS has completed studies for several of our federal reservoirs to aid in the understanding of sedimentation. Some of those reservoirs include Canopolis and Tuttle Creek Lakes, Clinton Lake, Cheney Reservoir, John Redmond Reservoir, and some other small impoundments. Today, we're going to focus on data collected for John Redmond Reservoir and the Cottonwood and Neosho River basins. So sediment is the primary aquatic impairment in the United States, including Kansas, and reservoir sedimentation decreases storage capacity, flood control, water supply, recreation, wildlife habitats, and degrades water quality. Water quality impacts range from issues with water treatment due to high turbidity to strains on phytoplankton and aquatic macrophytes from lower light conditions to increase nutrient transport. Solutions for mitigation can be costly and time consuming. It's important for effective management strategies to understand how and when sediment is being delivered to the reservoirs. All right, so suspended sediment concentration is a discretely measured constituent. It's not directly measured in real time. Continuously measured turbidity is often used as a surrogate for suspended sediment concentration, since it is an indicator of sediment and other solid material transported in streams. The use of turbidity data in regression models can provide more reliable and reproducible estimates. Stream flow is also sometimes used as a surrogate for suspended sediment concentration, but usually explains substantially less variance and may result in over or under predictions depending on the site where you are using those surrogate models. In this example included here on this slide from Foster 2014, comparison of two models. One, the top model, was developed with turbidity as the explanatory variable, and the other on the bottom was using stream flow. It demonstrates the lower variance explained by the models developed with the stream flow as surrogate. The surrogate model using turbidity has a 0.97 coefficient of determination and a much smaller range of values within that 90% prediction interval compared to the surrogate model using stream flow, which just indicates a better performing model. All right, so John Redmond Reservoir and drainage basin, including the Cottonwood and Neosho rivers, has a lot of focused efforts over the last 10 to 15 years to address the estimated 42% loss of storage in the conservation pool. The USGS has been continuously monitoring temperature, specific conductance, and more importantly, turbidity as it relates to sediment for over 10 years on the Cottonwood and Neosho rivers. Many stream bank stabilization projects have been concentrated in this watershed, as well as the dredging operation that took place in 2016 that removed 3 million cubic yards of sediment. Many of the stream bank stabilization projects have been implemented along the Cottonwood River, which is seen in this figure from the Kansas Water Office. And the Cottonwood River is that lower river that you see that has kind of all of the blue dots along it, and a couple of orange ones too, which are the planned stabilization points. So that would be the Cottonwood arm, and then you've got your upper Neosho, which is going to be the one right above it. So a lot of the efforts have been focused on that Cottonwood stem of the Cottonwood and Neosho River that flow into John Redmond Reservoir. All right, so John Redmond Reservoir has a primarily agricultural drainage basin of about 3,015 square miles. And that includes the Cottonwood and Upper Neosho rivers. The USGS, in cooperation with the Kansas Water Office, have operated continuous water quality monitors in this watershed, including 3 sites above and 1 site below John Redmond Reservoir since 2007. Water quality monitoring at these 4 sites provide 15-minute measurements of water temperature, specific conductance, and turbidity. Discrete water quality samples were also collected at these sites and used to develop the regression models, establishing relations between turbidity and suspended sediment concentration. There are a few periods without water quality data at 3 of the 4 sites between 2010 and 2019 due to extreme drought conditions or temporarily discontinued during the study period. I just want to point that out because there will be some data that I show where we won't have estimates for those time periods, and that's just partially due to missing data from those periods when the monitors weren't in operation. All right, so analysis of the 10-year period from 2010 to 2019 included suspended sediment loads to and through John Redmond Reservoir, as well as the trapping efficiency of the reservoir. The annual reservoir trapping efficiency ranged from 82 to 94%. And the largest sediment mass trapped was during 2019, which was about 2.2 million tons of sediment. Estimates of total reservoir storage lost to sedimentation during the analysis period was about 8,690 acre feet, which is about 17% of the remaining storage space of John Redmond Reservoir that was reported in 2007. The sedimentation rate during the analysis period was almost 2 times larger than the designed annual sedimentation rate for John Redmond Reservoir when the reservoir was constructed. Mean daily suspended sediment loads were 3.5 times larger at our Cottonwood monitoring site, so that was on the Cottonwood arm, compared to our Burlingame monitoring site, which was on the Upper Neosho arm. So the Cottonwood consistently had larger concentrations and loads than the Burlingame site, suggesting that larger sediment contributions coming from the Cottonwood River compared to the Upper Neosho River. Since much of the focus in the watershed is on streambank stabilization and other efforts to reduce sedimentation in streams, we also analyzed the suspended sediment loads that were transported at flows greater than the National Weather Service flood action stage, which for the 3 sites upstream of John Redmond Reservoir, this was about 0.1 to 5% of the total record period. So of those 10 years that we analyzed. About 56%, so over half of the total suspended sediment load was transported during flows above flood action stage, when localized efforts of stream erosion protection are likely to be overwhelmed, which is a pretty substantial amount when you've got over half of the sediment load going in that 0.1 to 5% of the record period. The greatest percent of the total load transported above flood action stage occurred in 2019, which we've heard some people talk today about the above normal precipitation rates and flooding that occurred in 2019. Of the 3 upstream sites that we monitor, Neosho Rapids had the largest percent of total load transported above flood action stage. However, with its location below the confluence of the Cottonwood and Upper Neosho River, and then also being right above the reservoir, it spent substantially more time above flood action stage compared to our Cottonwood and Burlingame sites, which was about 124 days compared to 23 to 26 days. So something to keep in mind when looking at those numbers. Looking a little deeper into the 2019 flooding, mean stream flows were 2.4 to 3.5 times greater in 2019 than mean historical daily stream flows at those same sites. Because of the above average precipitation, which in this figure is represented by the dashed line in inches, which is located on the secondary y-axis of the figure, many of the reservoirs within this watershed were forced to release water, contributing to already above average stream flows downstream. In May alone, these reservoirs, so Marion on the top, Council Grove in the middle, and John Redmond on the bottom, recorded anywhere from 10 to 16 inches of precipitation, which is a lot. Many areas of the Cottonwood and Upper Neosho rivers experienced prolonged bank overflow. And in total, about 2,685 acre feet of reservoir storage was lost in 2019 alone, which was about 31% of the estimated total for the whole 10-year analysis period, just being transported in 2019 during the flood year of 2019. So what does this all mean? Overwhelmingly, research points to these extreme episodic events being the culprit for the majority of suspended sediment loads transported to reservoirs. With precipitation frequency and intensity projected to increase in the region, future sediment reduction strategies that account for extreme episodic events may be beneficial. One study by Lee and Foster used a two-dimensional hydrodynamic model to assess the potential for sediment trapping reduction in John Redmond Reservoir by altering reservoir outflow management. And during 2007 through 2010, when they ran the simulation, the 2D model indicated smaller trapping efficiencies up to 3%, when average residence times were kept relatively short and the reservoir was maintained near the normal operating capacity as opposed to the higher flood pool levels. And while 3% reduction may seem small, that reduction during the 2010 through 2019 analysis period would have equaled about 14% of the total sediment removed as part of the $20 million dredging project. Other strategies currently being implemented or considered include agricultural BMPs, streambank stabilization projects, which are already ongoing, but the addition of more, and then also dredging and water injection dredging, among lots of other strategies. So continued investigation of sediment reduction strategies is definitely needed, with the understanding that sedimentation rate is largely driven by high flows. And this study highlights the importance of continued water quality monitoring to determine effectiveness and changes in sediment transport. Our continued monitoring above and below John Redmond Reservoir will allow us to continue to understand sediment flux into and through John Redmond Reservoir. Continued collection of continuous and discrete water quality data could allow for trend analysis, specifically looking at flow normalized concentrations and fluxes upstream of John Redmond Reservoir to summarize changes or a lack thereof in the watershed with the ongoing targeted efforts that are occurring. I actually have a presentation in concurrent session 4 today, this afternoon, on trend analysis of flow normalized concentrations and fluxes in the Cheney Reservoir watershed for anyone interested. So I guess that's a little ninja plug, I suppose. But yeah, we kind of discussed how a long-term data set can give you more information on trends and changes. So with that, here is a list of some of my references, including the most recent report, which was released earlier this year. That includes all the information that I have presented today in this presentation. So I think we should have time for some questions, but I also included my contact information. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions that we don't have time for today or you don't think of until later. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much.
Pause.
We do have time for some questions. I see Admin has already typed one in. Would you like to ask it?
Yes. Let me just get my chat up. Here we go.
Sure, yeah, I can just ask it if it's easier. You mentioned you had some gaps in your turbidity data. For the periods when you didn't have the turbidity data available, did you try to use stream flow as a surrogate to fill those gaps?
I
And if
did.
so,
So
how
that
did that affect the trapping efficiency estimates?
Yeah, so I did that a couple of ways. So we did use Streamflow as a surrogate for some of the analysis. And then because Streamflow tends to overestimate sediment transport in this watershed specifically, one of the ways that I went around that was using so I used the Streamflow as a surrogate to determine those trapping efficiencies. But then what I did was for the years that we had a trapping efficiency due to having a full complete water quality record, I used that to get an average trapping efficiency for the reservoir. So it could be biased a little high, a little low, just dependent on the hydrologic variability of the years that were included. And typically the years that were missing were lower streamflow years. But I use that average trapping efficiency of John Redmond Reservoir to apply that to the overall trapping efficiency to get those estimates that I had for the entire period of record. So that's kind of the approach that I took. There's nothing really perfect when you're missing data, but I looked at it a couple of different ways to try and figure out the best way to represent that data. So good question. Hopefully that answered it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat so that the presenters can see them. Thank you, Ariel. We're going to move on to Kari Bigham. And we're going to solve all these problems here, right, in this breakout room. So Kari Bigham is an instructor and PhD candidate in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department at Kansas State University. Coming from a corn and soybean farm in Northeast Kansas, Kari plans to spend her career focusing on ways to manage and restore degraded streams that drain agricultural landscapes. To date, she has received funding from state agencies to monitor and improve streambank stabilization systems using both woody and rock structures. Additionally, Kari is a licensed engineer with experience designing stream bank stabilization and stream restoration systems, as well as water quality and quantity BMPs in both agricultural and urban settings. Kari lives adjacent to the Mighty Call River near the capital of Kansas with her husband, Dan, and their 2 kids. Okay, and here, take it away, Kari.
I think that was the funnest writing assignment I had, is write about yourself. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kari Bigham, as Debbie said. I think I know quite a few of you in here, but it's good to see some of your faces and to see at least your name on the list here. So today is going to be a little bit different than my normal presentation. In the past, I've presented a lot on the Cottonwood River, but because of the 2019 flooding, it's really kind of slowed that project down for me. So I decided to talk more about my PhD project, which the Cottonwood was, but you know how things, Murphy's Law comes into play. And so now the Smoky Hill project is my PhD project. So my presentation is titled Understanding Bank Erosion Downstream of a Large Dam in Kansas. And so what drove this research? So it kind of came after the fact. I was asked in 2015, 2016 by Ron Graber and the Upper Lower Smoky Hill RAPS program to monitor some woody revetment projects that they were installing on the Smoky Hill downstream of Kannapolis. And so it's kind of interesting, this RAPS program, they don't have any of the cost share funds that we normally get to stabilize banks. And so their banks are still eroding, and probably in some cases more than the upstream landowners. And so they still want to come up with solutions to try to slow down that bank erosion. But unfortunately, they don't have the funds like the others do. And so we were trying to, or they were trying to figure out a low cost solution to stabilize banks. And so what they came up with are woody revetments is what they ended up calling them. Basically, it's a, and by the way, can you see my screen? I just been talking. Okay. All right. So what this is they pull a riparian tree, root ball and all, dig down with an excavator, put the root ball into the bank, place a footer log on top, and then anchor that in with the duckbill anchor. And so that sounds like a good idea. And they pointed it downstream. It almost acts like a snow fence, trying to capture some of the sediment that's moving downstream, deposit there next to the eroding toe, and then hopefully everything will just work out and it'll be stable over the long run. But as Ariel and I think many others have commented on, is that in 2019, there was a ton of flooding everywhere. I mean, not just in Kansas, it was like throughout the US. They failed, not surprisingly. And so I got the next question, which is why, Kari, you did all this monitoring for the last 5 years. Why did they fail? And so of course, I came up with some ideas. I haven't settled on anything as the final answer. And I'm good at that. I'm delaying the answer. I need more data. But my first two thoughts that came to my mind was probably there was insufficient anchoring. So as I was watching them put these structures in, they uncovered quite a bit of sand. And I don't know if you played a lot in sandboxes growing up like I did, but you know, if you play around in sand, it doesn't really pack that well. It erodes really easy too. And so that was concerning from the get-go. We didn't really get to able to compact that soil to keep it in place. The other thing that was concerning is most of our projects, as others have talked about this, and Andrew and Jarran have talked about, is putting on vegetation. And to save money on this project, they decided, okay, we're going to skip that part and hope that nature just vegetates the bank. And so we didn't put any vegetation on the bank, which was also a little concerning as well. But the other thing that I thought was interesting, and something that I've done these type of designs before, and most of the time they're above reservoirs. And in those cases, the hydrograph is much more natural, more flashy. One thing that every time I went out to these projects, it was just interesting to see how long they kept that water up and just how that might affect bank erosion. And it seems silly, like of course it does, but we don't really, there's not, surprisingly, not a ton of research out there that kind of shows or proves that. And so this was the 2019 hydrograph at Mentor, which is about 70 miles downstream of the dam. And you can see here, so normally the 1.5 year return interval is about 2,000 CFS. So most of the summer, it was above that 1.5 year return interval flow. And on top of that, it was held. I mean, it did its job. Let's say congrats. I mean, the dam did its job. It was put there to control flooding. And yeah, we didn't have any flooding. So that was awesome. There was flooding kind of in the lower lying areas, but most part, these fields stayed dry, which is great. And that's the whole purpose. But what other effects can that cause? And so now my question is, so I want to know why it failed. And number two, if I have to work on this stream that's being controlled by man, like really, like this is up to the Army Corps of Engineers to determine flow, how can I manage this as an engineer? How can I stabilize stream banks? It's different than my natural hydrographs and sediment regime that I'm used to. I have to kind of consider how we operate, and that's a challenge. So I dug into the research on this, and it's not surprising that dams, and they've been doing research on this for, I don't know, early 1900s, when they started putting large dams in, basically. We know how dams can affect stream, and especially upstream here in Kansas. Reservoir sedimentation is the big one. We put in a dam. This is Tuttle Creek Lake. This is the Fancy Creek arm. This is Randolph here. I might be here. Anyway, my dad always talked about water skiing this back in the 70s, and that's not the case anymore because of reservoir sedimentation. Another component that's often not really considered, but it is happening, is the same reason why our reservoirs are filling in with dirt. Our channels upstream are also, because we've changed the hydraulic gradient, the sediment transport capacity isn't as high as it used to be, and so our channels are filling in too and aggrading. So that's upstream, but what about downstream? So I'm used to working upstream of reservoirs, but what about downstream? Obviously, it alters the flow regime, especially if it's a flood control dam. So we go from a more spiky or flashy type hydrograph. This is Mill Creek near Paxico. There are some dams upstream of this gauge, but they're not quite to the same extent as like Canopolis and Tuttle Creek. And so you could see just how flashy that stream is. And this is from December 2019 to February 2020. This is the same time frame, but different location. This is the Smoky Hill River near Lindsborg, which is about 40 miles downstream of Canopolis Dam. And you can just see how much it's just flattened. It's like a bunch of steps, and that's just not normal. I mean, it wouldn't happen like that naturally. So we've definitely altered the flow regime. Another thing that we've altered is the sediment regime. And Ariel kind of talked about that too, the trapping efficiency of these reservoirs. So basically, and I love this quote from a book that I love. It's called Fluvial Processes in Geomorphology by Leopold Woolman and Miller. And they say in the book, it is difficult to conceive of a climate change producing a change in vegetation on the watershed such that 95% of the sediment would no longer be delivered to the stream system. So for example, Uracek, and I'm sorry, Dr. Uracek, I don't know if that's how you say your last name. I always mess that up. I think he's in this group, so I apologize ahead. But he figured out that the Canopolis Dam has a trapping efficiency of 95%. So basically, it's like saying that we have this major climate change happening, that at one time we had a desert and it rained and all this sediment would go down the stream channel. But now we put this dam in, it's trapped 95% of the sediment. So now it's like having that same desert turn into a jungle. And now all that sediment no longer can make it to the stream. That is a drastic change. So how does that affect streams? And obviously, if we have any changes that causes this channel evolution thing to happen, this is a very simple schematic from Shum, but we see degradation followed by aggradation and channel widening through bank erosion until we finally create this cute little stream at a lower elevation that has able to connect to its floodplain again. And that takes decades, if not centuries. So if we change the flow and the sediment, we're going to see changes in the channel. Shields showed that channel migration rates tend to decrease downstream of dams. This is actually below Fort Peck Dam in Montana on the Missouri River. This is what the stream looked like, the Missouri River, how it changed in the 1890s and 1910s. 20-year period after the creation of the dam, it didn't hardly change at all. So the rivers are pretty much stuck in place now if they're below dams. Other things that people have noticed is that the braided channels tend to narrow. Single threaded channels, kind of like the Smoky, but it could have been braided at one time, tend to widen. So a good example of that is the Platte River up in Nebraska and Wyoming. They put some large dams there as well. And they've actually decreased the width of the Platte River by up to 80 to 90% in some areas. And just think about, how much that has affected habitat. Low flow channels have become larger and high flow channels seem to narrow. So this is a study done by HUP in 2009 in North Carolina. Because we have to keep our base flows higher, so we still got the same amount of water going downstream, but now as man, we can control how that water goes downstream so it doesn't flood. We still got to get that water downstream, and so we have higher base flows. And what HUP was seeing was that our erosion near the toe of the river was becoming higher because of that longer flow release, while the higher flow channels sort of narrowed up. And that's kind of shown here too, like typically, and I'm guessing the hydrograph could have, started closer to 100 CFS, come up and then come back down. But here we're keeping that flow at a steady flow at all times. And how is that going to affect bank erosion? So that's obviously what I'm focusing on, is how have dams affected bank erosion rates. Obviously, that's going to depend on how the dam is being operated, what our boundary conditions are, how far we are from the dam, and time. Those are a lot of things, but it's still interesting, especially if we have eroding banks downstream of these reservoirs in Kansas. How can we help these landowners not lose their land? So my research objectives are to evaluate the effects Canopolis Dam closure has had on flow, channel bed stability, channel migration rates, and then finally bank erosion rates. So I felt like I needed to know these three before I could really feel good about this. And so I did this up to 70 miles downstream on the Smoky. So here is Canopolis. I looked at Ellsworth gauge, which is about 30 miles upstream. I looked at the Langley gauge, which is a half mile downstream, the Lindsborg gauge, which I think is about 40 miles, and then the Mentor, which is 70. And our sites that we put these structures on are between 40 to 70 miles downstream. So sites 5 and 6. Site 2 was more of a control reach. And I did all the geomorphic surveys, did cross-section surveys, all sorts of stuff. And I have that data for 5 years. So how am I going to do this? So for the flow, Woolman and Williams did a study in 1984 looking at specifically downstream of the Smoky Hill, or of the Canopolis Dam on the Smoky. So I kind of continued that till present day to see how we have affected flow. And then I also looked at channel bed stability, and the same thing. Dr. Yurchek also has done this study up to 2010. He published the last time was in 2011, so I just continued that to present day. I'm also going to do a channel migration rate study using aerial imageries that are georeferenced from 1985, 04, and 19. But I'm also using a publication done by Dr. Dort at KU. I think he's retired now. It's called Historic Channel Changes of the Kansas River and its Major Tributaries. He made this beautiful publication that showed how the rivers have changed. And this is actually the Smoky Hill River near Marquette, which is not too far. It's within that 70-mile range. So I'm pulling this data. I have the GIS files to show how those migration rates have changed prior to dam installation, which was again in 1948 and post. And then finally, after I do all of this, I pull it all together to do some HEC-RAS and BSTEM modeling, which is 2D hydrodynamic sediment transport and bank erosion modeling. And I'm looking at basically a hydrograph that, what was it actually from 2015 to 2020? And then I'm working with the Army Corps of Engineers. They've actually pulled out Canopolis Dam and made the hydrograph of what it would have been without the dam there from 2015 to 2020. So I'm running those two flows to see how bank erosion has changed, and then taking that all into account to try to figure out how the heck to stabilize these stream banks. So my first objective for flow, obviously we have dampened our peak flows below Canopolis Dam because that was the whole point of the dam. We wanted flood control. So this shows that the gray is Ellsworth, the blue is Langley. That dashed line represents when we closed the dam, 1948, and it shows our stream flow. I apologize, I have to do it for my dissertation in metric, so this is all in metric units. But anyway, Ellsworth is upstream, Langley is directly downstream, and you can see just how much we have dampened our peak flows. And it shows statistically that it's significant. And so it's doing its job, but again, we still got to get all this water downstream. So how are we getting it downstream? Looking at our flow duration curves, which is based off of the daily flow analyses, basically it hasn't really changed. And I want you to focus on the two black lines. This is Langley, which is a half mile downstream of the dam. It hasn't really been that much different pre to post dam, up to about 10% exceedance probability. So this means that there's a 10% chance in any day that the flow could be this. So the lesser the percent, the more rare it is. And so what this is showing is that our really high flow events, our post-dam flows are less, which it should be because we're trying to control flow with our dam. But again, we still have to get that water downstream. So what they're doing is just increasing that flow at a little bit more, not as, how do I say that? They're still rare events, but they're keeping those at a little higher than normal than when it would have occurred naturally. So that 10% exceedant probability is kind of when things get different or become different. Mentor, which is 70 miles downstream, it's right about 40%, where you could see we're keeping our flows at the 40% exceedance probability higher than what it was before. But of course, our really rare events are less. And so again, that's how we balance. If we want to have flood control, we have to increase our flow someplace. And so this is where they're doing that. Our hydrograph has become more step-like. Okay, 5-minute warning, goodness, all right. Our hydrographs have been more step-like versus flashy in shape, with generally longer high flow duration and slower rising and falling limbs. And I thought, the part that I thought was most interesting about this bullet was this last piece. So before the dam, we had a certain rate in which the hydrograph would increase and then come back down. Well, since the dam, we've actually decreased that rate. And so it increases at a rate much slower than it used to, and it also comes down at a rate much slower than it used to. And I think that's going to be very interesting when I look at the bank erosion component, how that affects bank erosion. And finally, the last thing I pulled out of that, and I think this is maybe good from a biological perspective, is that our annual peak flow every year still happens in the summer months. So if there's one thing that we haven't changed, it's that. So that's great. Objective 2 is, again, is just a continuation of what Dr. Husic did in 2001 and 2011. So I'm just extending that out to, over the last 10 years. And so his data goes up to this point here, and then this is all the data I added. So from this is Ellsworth, which is again 30 miles upstream. You can see that since dam closure in 1948, that bed has slightly aggraded, but not by much, only about a foot. So that's one observation. This one is the most striking. This is showing degradation downstream of the dam, a half mile at Langley. And since dam closure in 1948, it's cut down 6.6 feet, which is shocking. So this is when the report was done for USGS, and I've added some more data points here. This is at Lindsborg. This one's a little bit different. There's just not as much data. We had some data gaps. So you can't have the same results as the other two sites, but nevertheless, I did it anyway. So this is what Husic did in 2001, and I added it for the last 5 years, and it appears to be pretty stable. But I will note that it seems to have graded somewhat over that 1940 to 1960 time range. And I think that could be related to the degradation that's occurring downstream. That sediment it cut out probably started depositing downstream. At least that's one possibility. And then also I looked at Mentor, which again, because of data gaps, we don't have much data, and then what the data I had, it's not as telling. But nevertheless, what I kind of gained from looking at all these sites is that at least over the last decade, it seems like the bed is kind of stabilized. So here is Mentor. This is at Lindsborg. You can see it's kind of stable. Oh, this is at Langley again, which is surprising because Husic mentioned that it was still decreasing, but it seems like in the last 10 years, it's starting to stabilize, which is interesting. And then finally, oh, sorry, went the wrong way. Ellsworth also seems to be stabilizing.
Okay, I think we're gonna be cut off in a minute or two. So just to warn you.
Unfortunately, I have not finished the last two objectives because I'm also a teacher and I just haven't gotten to it. But my hypotheses are that channel migration rates have decreased and bank erosion rates have increased. And the reason is because it's a conservation of mass or energy. We still got the same amount of water going downstream, but we used to be able to let that water go out on the floodplain, having those major geomorphic changes to help to kind of dissipate some energy. But now we don't get to do that anymore. We have to keep it in the channel. So that's why I think that bank erosion has increased while channel migration rates have decreased. So with that, there's my conclusion slide. And I want to thank everyone as well. I have many people that I've been talking to for their information. And I'll take your questions if you have any and if we have any time. If not, Bigham, Bigham at ksu.edu is my email address.
Okay, thank you for that energetic talk. Energetic like the water in the sediment.
Yeah, there you go.
So I don't know if they just cut us off But if we have questions, you can type them in or ask.
So I'll go back to my conclusion slide too. So if anybody wants to read that, kind of flew through it.
Yeah. Oh, there's my timer.
Well, I'm interested to hear if you guys have any comments, especially you USGS folks, because I have done a lot of work or taken a lot of stuff from your work. So if you do hear anything or have anything come to mind, just please reach out.
Yes, I think this is a good mix of people to reach out to and continue this conversation.
So Kari,
Yeah.
hi.
Hey, Don.
Hey, so this last question in your conclusion, is that what you're going to try to answer?
Yes, that's the end goal. So that's not my PhD research question, but that is kind of what's driven my original questions, I guess, is I'm trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we manage these stream banks if it's no longer nature that's kind of controlling the flow, it's man. And it makes it a lot confusing because we can't control even what we do. It just depends on what the year's like and what the goals are. And we have a lot of things to consider when we're downstream of these reservoirs, I guess. And so it almost would be easier if it was just all natural flow, honestly.
Thank you for your presentation. This is always so informative, and I hope you circle back. I'd love to hear your
Well, it
results.
definitely has an impact on the Kansas River too.
Hey, Kari, quick comment question. Good work. I appreciate all you have there.
Yeah.
When you're out in the Smoky and there's those very bare riparian areas, make sure you get a stack of cards from Andy and Jarran that you can share with those folks. So maybe get some plantings going along there.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, when we did this, I don't think they were getting into this natural seeding process yet, but yeah, that's definitely something we'll be doing in the future if we do something like this again.
Excellent.
Yeah, Kari, this is Scott. Great job as usual. I've heard that Corps of Engineers are starting to work more on the lines of looking at downstream impacts from reservoir management so they can start, I guess you would call, monitoring and metering that flow and still meet their in-lake goals. Have you been working with them at all?
I have had quite a few conversations. So Brian Twombly and John Shelley I've talked to, and I think we're still trying to figure out how everything meshes, because my other concern is if we make any major changes, we're just going to cause that channel evolution thing to go again, because the channel is already working based off of what we have been doing for the last 50, 60 years. And now we're going to change it again.
Right.
How is that going to affect things?
Right.
So that's kind of my concern. I don't want to change anything too much.
Yeah.
But it'd be nice if it's a little bit predictable, I guess.
Yeah.